Mysteriously, the leaves on this oak tree in my front yard started falling in early July. Even the invasion of gypsy moths we've had for the last 2 years did not cause the leaves to start falling in July. Hi, I'm George Page for Nature. And as it turns out, this oak and those of my neighbors are being attacked by a different enemy, the great and terrible oak skeletonizer. Actually, it's a small inchworm-like caterpillar with a voracious appetite. And when you look at a leaf against the light, you can see the things were aptly named. They've eaten almost everything but the veins, leaving an oak leaf skeleton. With a scientific name like Bucolatrix anciliella, you couldn't expect them to be very nice, and they're certainly not welcome at my house, because in enough numbers they could kill my tree. But just as mysteriously as the oak skeletonizers appeared and made the leaves fall in July, the tree and its leaves are fighting back with nothing less than chemical warfare, as we'll see in our film. And with any luck, my tree will win the war. We might think of leaves as nature's pacifists, green fodder for animals, including ourselves, who chew them, chop them down, and make them into nests and homes. They appear to show no signs of resistance. But does this really mean that leaves are passive? Plants, it's been claimed, are just very slow animals. And like animals, they must struggle to survive and reproduce. The war they fight is silent and bloodless, but nonetheless real. So how do we see signs of this invisible war? Phase 1 is chemical warfare. A few plants are out-and-out killers, even to large animals who usually learn to avoid them. The leaves of bracken, once fully developed, carry powerful carcinogens, which can even enter water supplies and cause cancer in humans. Ragwort, too, can cause serious liver damage to farm animals. The most usual symptom of ragwort poisoning in cattle is sudden death. But to produce sudden death chemical defenses, the plant must divert considerable energy from its other necessary functions. Instead, some use more primitive weapons, spines and thorns. On the whole, they're less effective. Many animals find ways of avoiding them. So most plants compromise and adopt chemical strategies which are more complex, more subtle. It may look like the easiest thing in the world to live just by eating leaves, much easier than being a predator, for example, but it isn't. A single leaf has very little nutritional value for a large and active animal, so that animal must consume huge quantities of them to keep itself fueled with energy. What's more, the cellulose, plus any defensive chemicals, makes leaves very hard to digest. The successful leaf eater needs specialized digestion, too. Because many monkeys spend much of their lives in trees, it's natural to expect that most of them would rely chiefly on leaves for their food. In fact, relatively few of them do. Such active animals need fruit, seeds, and insects to give them the required energy. But the colobus monkey has truly breached the leaf's defenses. No energy problem because it can consume huge quantities of foliage. The contents of its large stomach can constitute more than a quarter of its total body weight. And it has a very specialized digestion, too. Colobus monkeys have complex stomachs, rather similar to those of cows. Their stomachs contain bacteria which break down the cellulose and extract nourishment from it. They also neutralize many of the dangerous toxins in the leaf's chemistry, so the colobus can eat freely. It has overcome the leaf's defenses. Howler monkeys have a less sophisticated digestive system, so they have to be highly selective in their feeding. They must choose between various species, between young and old leaves, between those in the sun and those in the shade, to get a safe and balanced diet. They howl to defend the troops' right to particular food trees. In Australia, the cuddly koala feeds exclusively on an especially unfriendly tree, the eucalyptus. Not only are its leaves full of a whole battery of toxins, they're also very tough and fibrous. But the koala defeats them, again by a very special sort of digestion which selects out the nourishing parts. The koala can also cope because of its quiet, slow-moving lifestyle. It just doesn't need that much energy. But for every furry, warm-blooded leaf eater, there must be 1,000 miniature jaws gnawing away unseen. A caterpillar, for example, is a formidable eating machine. By the time it develops into a butterfly, it has consumed up to 20 times its body weight. Quite apart from chemicals, life in the trees can be difficult for a very small animal in a variety of other ways. Serrated edges make walking difficult. Hairy stems form an obstacle course. Rain and wind knock insects from their perches. The oak, king of many American woodlands, and a master in the skills of chemical warfare. Every year, the oak is attacked by hordes of insects. Over thousands of years, they have come to rely on the oak's existence. So every year, without waiting for the onslaught, the oak prepares its defenses. First priority is to spread its canopy, to start photosynthesis. The first young leaves it produces are defenseless, free from chemicals. At this stage, the oak will lose something like 7% of its total leaf area to foraging insects, an amount of damage it can cope with. But once the canopy is complete, there's an abrupt change of strategy. The oak now redirects its resources to the war effort. The leaves look green and nourishing. In fact, they're charged with chemicals. Some of the feeding insects will be poisoned, some deformed. Many will simply starve. The oak survives to build up its reserves for yet another year in its long life. Chemical warfare between leaf and insect is enormously important to plants. How can it be, then, that some of them seem to have virtually no chemical defenses? The hawthorn, for example, welcomes all comers. It relies only on conventional armaments. War for plants and humans alike is an expensive business. Resources must be diverted from the plant's other needs, resources that it can ill afford. If attacks on the plant are small and infrequent, pacifism may pay off. But brown-tailed moth caterpillars are prone to sudden population explosions. They advance like the hordes of Genghis Khan. The bush is totally stripped of its leaves. It puts up no defense. The ravenous caterpillars move on to the next bush. A rose bush, a close relative of the hawthorn, and another plant without chemical defenses. Eventually, the caterpillars have to move on to more and more distasteful plants. For the hawthorn, though, it's not a total disaster. Its roots will be well manured by insect droppings and fallen leaves. It should grow well again next year. Many of the caterpillars, meanwhile, will simply die. Winter in summer. But the hawthorn can survive as a pacifist, provided it doesn't get attacked every year. In some cases, man seems to have gone out of his way to help predatory insects in their struggle with the leaves. The vast monoculture of a conifer plantation means that pine pests are offered a feeding area many miles wide. The pine beauty moth uses the shoots to lay her eggs. Pine sawfly larvae feed communally and hope to startle a bird predator by their sudden movements. They also incorporate the plant poisons in their bodies to make themselves distasteful to birds. The caterpillars of the pine beauty moth, on the other hand, hope to escape attention by leading a solitary life. But if caught by a patrolling ant, it is vulnerable. Unlike the sawfly larvae, which can bubble poisons from their tiny mouths. In the course of their foraging trips over the length and breadth of the tree, ants perform a useful task for the leaves by removing many would-be predators. It's been shown that a tree defended by ants grows significantly better than a tree without them. Some plants have evolved a compromise between total defense and no defense. Plants like the alder, which colonize new habitats. Some years they'll be attacked, others not. The alder plays a wait-and-see game. At first, the leaf contains no toxins, but as soon as it's damaged, a halo of chemicals builds up around the hole. The insect is forced to move on. Soon the whole leaf is affected, then the whole twig. Within a matter of hours, it's impossible for the caterpillar to find a meal anywhere on the tree. It will either be poisoned or starve to death. The alder sustains damage, but it still has plenty of leaves to spare. Silver birches behave much the same way. They too are colonizers and short-lived compared to a Methuselah like the oak. They too respond to insect damage by swiftly bringing chemical defenses into action. And as insects are driven in search of wholesome leaves, they're likely to be snapped up by keen-eyed blue tits, the tree's allies. But there's something even more remarkable. Not only does the damaged birch swiftly defend itself, it even seems able to warn its neighbors. An injured tree, it appears, gives off chemical messages through the air. Uninjured trees downwind of it receive this message, and they too build up their leaf toxins in advance of the insect attack. Trees, you might say, have found a way to communicate with each other. But leaves don't have it all their own way. The monarch butterfly has learned to take over a plant's chemical weapons and use them as its own. The monarch gets its handsome orange color from the plant it feeds on as a caterpillar, and something more important besides. Monarchs, which are common throughout much of the United States and Canada, lay their eggs on various plants of the milkweed family. Milkweeds are rich in a group of poisons that are used in minute quantities to treat heart disease in humans. The caterpillars, however, are able to absorb these poisons in quantity and consequently are avoided by predators throughout their adult lives. And their adult lives are pretty adventurous. In winter, millions of these U.S.-born butterflies head south to Mexico, a journey of up to 2,000 miles. They look vulnerable, but they're protected by the milkweed poisons in their bodies. As the spring sunshine invades their roosting places, they start to rouse and stretch their wings. The monarch's springtime dance must have taken place here for centuries, yet their roosting sites were only discovered in the mid-1970s. A remarkable story. But there's a twist. A minority of the monarchs have not fed on toxic milkweeds as caterpillars, so they're not poisonous as adults, and some birds have discovered this. Birds of just a few species, mostly orioles and grosbeaks, have learned how to pick out the non-poisonous ones. No one knows how they do it. They feed with impunity. But the vast majority of monarchs remain untouched. Still high in their Mexican retreat, they mate. Soon they will be on the wing, heading north again to the United States, where they will lay their eggs on the milkweed plants that ensure their survival. Chemical warfare is enormously important in the Battle of the Leaves, but the war is fought on many other fronts too. One of the most intriguing takes place in deserts all over the world. It's surprising, but these spines are leaves, modified leaves. They've adapted to live in an area where the temperature rises to 113 degrees Fahrenheit and only 10 inches of rain fall throughout the year. In New England, by contrast, there's an average of 40 inches per year. Here, a dove sits to shade her eggs, not to keep them warm. About 14% of the world's land surface is occupied by deserts. Plants have had to find some amazing ways to live in them. The prickly pear has two types of spines, long ones for defense, short hairy spines to shade it against the sun. The desert sun can kill, and at the highest temperatures, even the prickly pear wilts and dies. Many cactuses use their spiny leaves to break up the air into cooling eddies to conserve moisture and provide shade. In some cases, light is kept out so effectively that the plant's growth is stunted. The grizzly bear cactus remains delightfully furry, but small. Of course, it's also important for desert plants to defend themselves against animals. The buckhorn cholla has a modest armament of spines. It's also defended by oxalic acid. But the Cosyra moth caterpillar still oozes its way to the tip. And plants have other ways of dealing with the desert. The ocotillo has throwaway leaves. In drought, it discards them. After rain, it grows them again in 48 hours. Its pleated bark expands to make room for moisture. Its weird cousin, the boojum, stores water in its trunk. Some plants, like the candelilla, have given up leaves entirely and photosynthesize through their stems. There's a shrub that behaves in a similar way, the palo verde. But it also photosynthesizes through its tiny leaves. In drought, it drops the leaves and falls back on using its green bark. The palo verde is also nurse to the desert giant, the saguaro cactus. A baby saguaro can't survive the direct rays of the sun. The palo verde protects it. A full-grown saguaro may be 200 years old and weigh up to 10 tons, 90% of it stored water. Each inch takes 5 to 10 years to grow. But the most remarkable thing about this superb desert survivor is that its ancestors originated in a very different sort of forest, a forest where water is more than plentiful. Despite their more recent adaptations to drought, saguaros had their distant origins in tropical rainforests. In these lush forests, plants face just the opposite problem. In the desert, they must conserve every drop of moisture. Here, water is superabundant. The struggle is for light. It's a civil war, leaf against leaf. Each fights for its place in the sun. The dense foliage of the forest canopy shuts off light from the forest floor below. Lianas seek the sun by climbing up the trees. Leafing must be postponed until they reach the top. Bromeliads start at the top, or halfway up at least. They use their host's trunk purely as a perching place. They contribute nothing to the tree's welfare and take nothing away. Young trees must wait for dead men's shoes. Until a gap appears in the canopy, there's no chance for them to grow. But as soon as a tree falls, the seedlings all strive to take its place. Ferns make the best use of light by sharing it. Light filters through the gaps between the leaflets so that the plant's lower leaves get some too. Monsteras have brought this technique to a fine art. Holes right through the leaf blade to let the light pass through. But this is surely the ultimate in the Civil War, a plant that actually kills to live. The strangler fig starts as a seed dropped in the crown of its host by a bird or monkey. At first, its roots cling to the host's branches, then reach down toward the ground. Gaining strength, the strangler now forms a network round the tree and gradually crushes it to death. Not all stories of leaf competition are so lurid. In rainforest, new tender shoots are often brilliantly colored. It's thought this is to protect the young leaves against ultraviolet rays. It's also believed that because insects have adapted to feed on green leaves, colorization repels predators. Whatever the reason, many of these leaves are a riot of color and texture. The dense canopy is full of a menagerie of leaf-using animals, including leafcutter ants. These ants have evolved a special technique. They tear away countless segments and take them to underground gardens, where they grow a special fungus food for their colony. In temperate woodlands, too, plants compete for light. Instead of leaves being discarded and renewed throughout the year, deciduous leaves are, of course, shed in the fall and renewed in spring. This is why bluebells and other spring wildflowers have evolved to bloom and leaf early, while sunlight still filters through the bare branches of shade trees. But once those fresh new leaves appear, plants deploy them skillfully to make the best possible use of light. By adjusting shape and size and angle, the tree constructs an elegant three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle to ensure that each leaf gains access to the sun. It is this which gives each woodland its distinctive shape and atmosphere. Down among the nettles, much the same thing is happening. Each individual plant carefully adjusts the shape and placing of its leaves. The young leaves are smaller, of course, and the old leaves farther down are larger. But the way they're deployed around the central stem and the delicate adjustments in shape are quite subtle. Some plants secure their place in the sun in much more aggressive style. Rhododendron ponticum was introduced to England in the 18th century. It became very popular with landscape gardeners there and also with insects like bees and hoverflies. It's much less popular with English naturalists because of its tendency to take over and drive out native plants. This rhododendron has thick, waxy, evergreen leaves. Throughout the year, there's a pool of deep gloom beneath it. Little chance for a young seedling to spring up here. In addition, the leaves harbor a powerful toxin which drips onto the earth beneath. Decaying leaves add toxin, too, a sort of natural weed killer. Even after the rhododendron dies or is cut down, it's a long time before anything else can grow in its place. A distinctly aggressive plant. These leaves seem totally at the mercy of the weaver bird building its nest. In situations like this, neither poisons nor thorns can help them. But do leaves employ any other techniques which remind us of human warfare? Do they use camouflage, for example? Certainly, leaves are used as camouflage by many different kinds of animals. And some of these animals help the plant by feeding on the creatures that would damage its leaves. And yes, there are one or two plants that use camouflage themselves. Lithops, for example, living stones of the South African desert. Each plant has just 2 succulent leaves. To conceal themselves from thirsty animals, they imitate the colors and patterns of the pebbles among which they grow. Other plants subject to insect attack use camouflage to imitate another plant. Prayer plants seen in full light have large, juicy leaves, but in the more typical gloom of the forest floor, they imitate a smaller plant. The leaves appear insignificant. A hungry insect might look elsewhere. There's even one plant which almost achieves the ultimate disappearing trick. Heavy rain, falling debris, or grazing animals trigger a series of electrical charges in its leaves, and the plant collapses. It's called the sensitive plant. Techniques like these are oddities of the plant kingdom, and there are others. Pandas are largely dependent on bamboo for their food. When large areas of bamboo all flower at the same time and then die, many pandas starve. It's even been suggested, but not proved, that the bamboo thus controls the population of its panda predators. But what about plants which seem truly aggressive? Roman soldiers are supposed to have beaten themselves with nettles, hoping the stings would make them feel warmer. The nettle certainly needs its weapons. Growing in soils rich in phosphorus and nitrogen, the nutritious leaves would be much too attractive to grazing animals if they weren't defended. And yet, the nettle, so well protected against large animals, is very vulnerable to insects. Indeed, it's the principal food of several species of butterfly larvae, like the peacock. They seem quite unaffected by the stinging hairs. It's not clear how they achieve their immunity, but it may be connected with a special feature of the nettle's chemical defenses. When an animal brushes against it, the spines break off at the tip and inject 2 chemical compounds. On its own, either of these is harmless. Combined, they cause intense pain. The caterpillars may be so light that they fail to release both chemicals. Many other insects, too, seem immune to the nettle's armory. Hordes of aphids wander unharmed among the stinging hairs, sucking juice from the stems. And yet, the nettlebed jungle is still a dangerous place. It has its own insect tigers, the predatory larvae of the garden ladybug. It's not difficult for such powerful insects to hunt down slow-moving aphids on the nettle's hairy stem. The nettle, then, is a Jekyll and Hyde plant, harmless to some, aggressive to others. But we've yet to meet the most aggressive plants of all, the killers. This innocent-looking plant is a sundew. It's a flesh eater. On its leaves are glands which provide the plant with the equivalent of claws and teeth and stomachs. Throughout the world, there are nearly 100 different species of sundew. They share one feature which is unique among carnivorous plants. The same glands carry out the entire process, from luring the prey to finally digesting it. Plants that kill do so in order to occupy habitats, marshes in particular, where other plants can't survive because they're poor in nutrients. Nutrients which the killers can absorb from their captives. Sarracenias are among the most beautiful of the killer plants. Again, the traps are leaves, but their color, perfume, and nectar make them seem like flowers. Whereas sundews entwine their prey in sticky tentacles, Sarracenias catch them just as effectively without moving at all. The inside of the pitcher is coated with loose wax, which clogs the insect's feet and tumbles it into the trap. Early travelers to Madagascar returned with stories of a plant which could eat a man, and this is rats. Its digestive fluid is comparable to the gastric juices with which a mammal digests its prey. Each of these death-dealing devices originates once again in an innocent-looking leaf. Starting as a normal leaf shoot, it gradually changes as it grows. The leaf tip twists and hollows out until finally it becomes a recognizable pitcher. This plant is considered the great wonder of the vegetable world, the familiar Venus flytrap. The Venus flytrap is very selective. Its traps are designed to catch only the right sort of prey. If the sensitive hairs are correctly triggered, the traps close with amazing speed. If not, the insect will go free. The operation of the traps has long been a mystery, but recently it's been discovered that triggering the hairs actually stimulates the plant to instant growth. In just a fraction of a second, the trap produces new cells all along its hinge, and it clangs shut. The amazing adaptations of these killer plants are one of the results of a centuries-old battle between leaf and insect, a battle much older than man. Heliconids are a family of brightly colored butterflies found in the tropical areas of the Americas. While the adults can take nectar from many kinds of flowers, their caterpillars can only feed on the appropriate species of passion vine. Passion vines contain toxins, but each heliconid has cracked the code of its particular food plant. The female flutters over the vines looking for the correct one. She recognizes it by the shape of the leaves. Is it this one or this one? Hard to tell. Passion vines have reacted by disguising their leaves in an incredible number of different forms. Each one mimics some other plant in the area which the caterpillar could not eat. All these are leaves of passion vines, and this is the seedling of this adult plant. In time, of course, the butterflies will crack this code too. So the next stage of the battle involves psychological warfare. It's based on the butterfly's egg-laying habits. Most of these heliconids prefer to lay each of their eggs in isolation, just one on a leaf-tipped tendril in a prominent place. There are good reasons for this. One is to ensure fresh food for the new larva when it hatches. But there's a more important reason why the butterflies lay their eggs singly. The emerging larvae are cannibals. One of these caterpillars will have no compunction about adding a potential rival to its menu. The passion vine plays on the butterfly's reluctance to lay where other eggs are already present. It produces its own mimic eggs to persuade the butterfly that its leaves are not a good place to lay. These are mimic eggs. This is a real one. Here's a real egg on the right, mimics on the left. Some look more convincing than others, but they seem to influence the butterfly and protect the leaves from being eaten. One of the passion vine's most successful ruses is also one of the oldest in the history of plants. It forms an alliance with insects. To observe this part of the butterfly war, we move from the rainforest to a rough pasture in Georgia, another place where passion vines flourish. Here, the enemies are not heliconids, but other butterflies and leaf-chewing insects. Like so many plants, passion vines enjoy an age-old confederacy with bees. The flower must be pollinated within a few hours. It will be dead by the end of the day. The plant has other allies far less obvious than the bees, but at least as important. Perhaps we should call them mercenaries instead of allies. The plant pays them for their services by providing them with food. These nodules provide a special source of nectar, very similar to that produced by the flower. In return, the ants defend their plant against the many insects which would damage its leaves, and therefore reduce its powers of photosynthesis. The ants are constantly on patrol. The ants' protection is highly effective. Plants not patrolled by them suffer much more leaf damage and produce fewer fruits than plants with ants guarding them. It's a variation on the upstairs-downstairs story. Upstairs, the handsome bee feasts on flowers. Downstairs, the ant feeds in more humble fashion. But above all, it's another fascinating example of how plants defend themselves. Another campaign in the battle of the leaves. As autumn comes, the leaves turn golden and fall. We rely on them growing anew when spring returns. But we also rely on them in another sense. Only green plants can convert the sun's energy into food and provide us with oxygen. We burn them, eat them, destroy them. Yet without the power of leaves, almost all life on Earth would come to an end. If the Battle of the Leaves has aroused your curiosity, you might want to keep a lookout for 2 other films in the Nature series that will delve deeper into the lives of a couple of the plants you just saw. One will examine the life in and around the giant saguaro cactus of the American Southwest. And the other is about the many plants that in their search for food have become carnivorous, reversing the usual roles of animals and plants. I'm George Page for Nature.
Next on 11, the story of a brilliant choreographer, from ballet to Broadway to film. Stay tuned as Great Performances presents Dance in America, Agnes the Indomitable DeMille.